The sliding doors of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport opened with a soft whoosh. A 7-year-old girl named Lena walked in, wearing a bright yellow dress that sparkled in the morning light. Her braids had colorful beads that made a soft clicking sound as she bounced with excitement. In one hand she held a stuffed elephant named Mocha. In the other she held her mother's hand tightly. Lena didn't know that this trip to New York would change anything. She only knew she was going to meet her great-grandpa for the first time. And for something so special, she wore her favorite dress because important days needed sunshine. Her mother, Naomi, walked beside her. She looked calm and strong, dressed in a sharp blazer and neatly pressed jeans. She had spent years traveling for work, moving through airports and big offices where people didn't always expect her to belong. But she had learned something important. Always walk like you belong even when others don't think you do. Their flight, number 2187, was boarding at gate C-24. Naomi had picked their seats carefully, row 14 by the window and middle seat. It was close enough to the front for a quick exit but not too close where people might stare or whisper. She could feel eyes on them now, some glancing politely, others staring longer. But Lena didn't notice. She was too busy being excited. "Do you think we'll see a castle in the clouds?" Lena asked, swinging Mocha under her arm. Naomi smiled. "Maybe if you look hard enough you might even see a dragon." Lena gasped. "A friendly one?" "The friendliest," Naomi said. They walked down the narrow aisle of the airplane, Lena's yellow dress shining between the dark blue seats. Naomi found their row. "Here we are, window and middle, just like you wanted." Lena jumped into her seat and pressed her nose against the window. "It's so big out there, Mommy." "I know, baby." Naomi put their bags in the overhead bin and sat beside her daughter. She opened her tablet to check her emails, but then she took a deep breath. This flight wasn't just about Lena meeting her great-grandfather. It was about family and history, something Naomi herself was still learning about. Around them, people settled into their seats. The sound of overhead bins closing and seatbelts clicking filled the plane. Lena hugged Mocha and whispered, "Mocha's never been on a plane before. But I told her not to worry. She's safe with us." Naomi smiled and brushed a curl from her daughter's forehead. "She is." Across the aisle, a man in a brown hoodie sat quietly. He didn't stand out much, but when their eyes met, he gave Naomi a small nod. She nodded back, feeling like she had seen him before, though she couldn't remember where. She didn't think much of it, not yet. Outside the window, the morning sun made the runway shine like gold. Lena bounced in her seat, ready for takeoff. Neither of them knew that in 3 hours, this flight would become a story no one on board would ever forget. The airplane engines hummed softly. Most passengers were settled in, looking at their phones, flipping through safety cards, or half listening to the flight attendants. Naomi scrolled through her emails. A meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. She sighed. This trip to New York was supposed to be a break before a big work presentation. But for now, she just wanted to focus on Lena. Her daughter leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the window. "Mommy," she whispered, "the clouds aren't here yet." "They'll show up soon, sunshine," Naomi said. "Just wait." Lena nodded and hugged Mocha tight, happy to wait for the magic. Then Naomi heard it, a voice that was too polite, like a smile that didn't feel real. "Excuse me, ma'am." Naomi turned. A young flight attendant stood beside her. She had blonde hair pulled into a tight bun and a name tag that read Heather. Her smile looked stiff like plastic. "Yes?" Naomi asked, keeping her voice calm. Heather leaned in, lowering her voice. "We need to make a quick seating change. Would you and your daughter be willing to move to row 27? Naomi blinked. "I'm sorry. Is there a problem with our seats?" No, Heather said quickly. "It's just that we have a family with a medical need. They were hoping to sit closer to the bathrooms. Row 14 is perfect for them." Naomi looked toward row 27. It was at the very back of the plane, right next to the restroom. A pair of toddlers were already there, shrieking and throwing a juice box down the aisle. "And you're asking us to move?" Naomi's voice stayed calm, but it had changed slightly. "It would be a nice thing to do," Heather said, her smile twitching. "The other family has a child with special needs." Naomi nodded slowly. "My daughter is 7. I paid extra for these seats. We're not moving." Lena looked up at her mom, feeling the change in energy. She grabbed Mocha's trunk and squeezed it. Heather hesitated, then added, "The other family has already asked." Naomi turned her head and saw them. A tall white man in a fancy blazer, a blonde woman in expensive shoes, and a serious-looking boy about Lena's age. They stood near row 14, not asking, not explaining. just waiting like the seats were already theirs. If they are premium customers, Naomi said, why don't they take the open first-class seats near the front bathroom? Heather's smile vanished. Those seats are for premium customers. Naomi sat up straighter. We are premium customers. Beside her, Lena tugged on her sleeve. Her voice was small but clear. Mommy, is this like when the restaurant put us by the kitchen even though we had a reservation? Naomi didn't move, but Heather did. And behind them, someone else moved too, a quiet sound of leather shoes against the floor. The man in the brown hoodie stood up. The airplane cabin went still. It wasn't silent, but it felt frozen, like the moment before a storm. Seatbelts clicked into place. Flight announcements played faintly in the background. Overhead bins thudded shut. But here in row 14 time had stopped. Heather's smile wavered. Naomi turned slightly and saw the man in the hoodie standing in the aisle. He didn't move fast. He didn't speak right away. But his presence filled the space like gravity. He stepped forward, his soft shoes brushing against the floor. His hoodie was slightly wrinkled, his black t-shirt plain, his dark hair tied loosely at the back of his neck. He looked calm, watching everything. Heather instinctively stepped back. Another flight attendant, an older woman named Angela, walked over. She looked strict and in charge. Sir, please sit down. This situation. The man raised his hand, slow but firm. No. One word. Soft. Steady. But it cut through the tension like glass. Angela blinked. Excuse me? He didn't look at her. His eyes went from Heather to the waiting family, then finally to Naomi and Lena. I need you to explain, he said. Why are you asking this woman and her daughter to move instead of anyone else on this plane? Heather opened her mouth, but no words came out. Naomi's heart was beating fast. She was used to standing up for herself, but something about this quiet man, this strong wall of protection between her and unfairness, made her stop and stare. Lena leaned close to her, eyes big with wonder. Mommy, she whispered, is that? From behind them, someone gasped. A voice whispered just loud enough, that's Keanu Reeves. The news spread quickly like fire on dry grass. People turned their heads, whispers filled the cabin, and phones slipped out of pockets as passengers tried to capture the moment. A wave of surprise moved down the aisle like wind through a wheat field. Heather, one of the flight attendants, froze, her face turning bright red. Angela, another crew member, tightened her jaw as if trying to hold back an argument. Mr. Reeves, Angela said, trying to sound official, this is a crew matter. Keanu shook his head. I'm not here as an actor, he said calmly. I'm here as the co-founder of this airline. He reached into his hoodie and pulled out a small leather case. When he opened it, a silver logo shined, North Stream Air. Gasps filled the cabin louder this time. People whispered to each other, eyes wide with disbelief. I'm also here, Keanu continued, because I owe a man named Ezra Coleman more than I can ever repay. Naomi's eyes widened. You knew my grandfather? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu turned to her, and for the first time, his eyes softened. He saved my life, he said simply. Years ago, I was trapped in a small village during a relief mission. I couldn't get out. He made a call, pulled strings, and risked his name to help a stranger. He nodded toward Lena. If you are his family, you're not going anywhere. He looked at Angela and Heather. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can take the next flight. The entire plane went silent. Heather's lips parted, but she didn't say anything. Angela stared at the badge in Keanu's hand like it might disappear if she blinked. The passengers standing in the aisle, the doctor, the woman in fancy heels, the boy with crossed arms, suddenly looked unsure of themselves. Naomi let out a slow breath, her heart pounding. She realized she was holding Lena's hand very tightly. When she loosened her grip, Lena wiggled her fingers. Mommy, Lena whispered, is he really the airplane boss? Naomi nodded, still stunned. Yes, baby, I think he is. Angela was the first to recover. Mr. Reeves, of course, we apologize for the misunderstanding. Keanu raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding is when someone forgets their boarding pass. This was a choice. Heather looked down, her cheeks still flushed. I didn't know who they were exactly. Keanu interrupted, his voice steady. You didn't know and you didn't care to. That's worse. The silence that followed wasn't angry, it was ashamed. Heather mumbled something about free drinks and hurried away. Keanu turned back to Naomi. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Naomi finally found her voice. You knew my grandfather? He nodded. Captain Ezra Coleman. A Tuskegee airman. Your last name caught my eye when you boarded, but I wasn't sure. Not until your daughter mentioned him. Lena sat up proudly. That's my great-grandpa. We're going to see him now. Keanu smiled, warm and genuine. Then you're on an important trip. From the front of the cabin, Angela returned. But she looked different now, softer, humbled. In her hands were 2 cups of hot chocolate, steam curling above the lids, tiny marshmallows floating on top. These are from the crew, she said gently, placing them on the tray table. With our sincere apologies. Naomi hesitated but accepted them. Thank you. Angela hesitated too. Miss Coleman, if you have a moment, I'd like a word. Lena looked at her mom. I'll watch Mocha. Naomi nodded and followed Angela to the small kitchen at the front of the plane, away from the passengers. Angela leaned against the counter. She wasn't stiff anymore. She looked tired, as if she had been carrying something heavy for years. I've been flying for 37 years, Angela said quietly. And I never thought I'd meet the family of Captain Ezra Coleman. Naomi blinked. You knew him? Angela swallowed hard. My father did. Lieutenant Jack Harrington. Bomber pilot. Dresden, 1945. His plane was going down. Half his crew was wounded. He always said he should have died that day. She paused, then added, but a pair of red-tail fighters came out of nowhere. They wouldn't leave his side until he was safe. She reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out an old, folded photograph. 2 young men stood side by side, one black, one white. Their eyes looked tired, their shoulders strong. That's your grandfather, Angela whispered. And this is my dad. Naomi stared at the picture, her breath catching. The edges were worn, the corners curled, but the image still spoke loudly. A bond forged in the sky and in battle. That's him, Angela said again, softer this time. Your grandfather. Naomi slowly reached out, touching the image of a younger Ezra Coleman, proud, strong, fearless. The other man, Angela's father, stood beside him like a mirror from another world. My dad said they didn't talk much, Angela continued. Didn't need to. He said Captain Coleman had this calm presence. Like he belonged in the sky. Like he didn't fear gravity. Naomi's throat tightened. He never talked about the war. Not much anyway. Angela nodded. A lot of them didn't. But my father remembered. He said your grandfather once told him, the sky doesn't care what color you are when you're saving each other's lives. I never forgot that. She handed the photo to Naomi. Keep it. My father would want you to have it. Naomi took it with trembling hands. Thank you, she whispered. Back in row 14, Lena turned around, peeking at the person across the aisle. A woman sat there now, older, with warm brown skin and silver dreadlocks tied in a wrap. She wore a purple scarf, glasses low on her nose, and had a kind but wise look. Lena gave a small wave. The woman smiled. Hello, young lady. Lena nodded toward the galley. My great-grandpa saved her dad. The woman chuckled. So I heard. And I believe every word. Naomi returned just in time to hear that. Her eyes drifted toward the woman. Something about her felt steady, grounded. The woman held out her hand. Dr. Elena Diggs. Planetary geologist. And one of the lucky few who got to interview your grandfather. Naomi's eyes widened. You interviewed Captain Coleman? Elena nodded. Years ago. During my research. My thesis was about segregated military units in World War II. Your grandfather's story was a big part of it. Lena's eyes sparkled. You're a real scientist? Elena smiled. I am. I study space rocks. Lena gasped. That's so cool. Elena laughed. Not as cool as flying AP-51 Mustang through enemy skies. Lena turned to Naomi. Can I sit with her for a minute? Naomi looked at Elena. If you're okay with it? Elena smiled. I'd be honored. Lena climbed over the seat and sat next to Nina. She held Mocha, her stuffed animal, close. She leaned in and whispered, Do you have stories about great-grandpa? Nina adjusted her scarf. I do. Want to hear one? Lena nodded excitedly. Nina began, One day your great-grandpa was told he couldn't eat in the officers' dining room. They told him to eat outside in the rain. Lena's eyes got big. What did he do? He stood there, soaking wet, and said, I'll eat where I'm allowed, but don't ask me to fight like a man and feed me like I'm not one. Naomi closed her eyes. The fire inside her family wasn't gone. It had just been passed down. The plane landed softly at LaGuardia Airport. But Naomi's heart still felt high up in the clouds. Lena wiggled with excitement, holding Mocha and the book Nina had given her like treasure. Her yellow dress sparkled in the sunlight from the window. Naomi looked down at the photo Angela had given her. It was still safe in her bag. It felt like a door to the past had opened while they were flying. A few minutes later, Angela came back with the captain. "Miss Coleman," the captain said with a kind nod, "we would like you and your daughter to leave the plane first to honor Captain Ezra Coleman's service." Naomi blinked in surprise. "Thank you." As she reached for their bag, Keanu appeared behind her. Naomi turned to him, unsure what to say. "Thank you again." Keanu gave a small smile. "Honestly, I should have said something sooner." There was a quiet moment. Then Lena tilted her head. "Do you want to come meet great-grandpa with us?" Naomi started to say something, but Keanu surprised her. "I'd love to." 30 minutes later, a car stopped in front of a brownstone house in Harlem. The house stood tall and strong, its steps clean, its brass doorknob shining in the afternoon sun. Time had touched this home, but it had not worn it down. Before they could knock, the front door opened. A tall woman stood there, her hair pulled back, her posture strong but graceful. Naomi froze. "Camille." Her cousin gave a small smile. "Hello, stranger. You brought company." Keanu nodded. Camille raised an eyebrow. "That Keanu?" Lena popped up between them. "He helped save our seats on the plane." Camille stepped aside. "Well then, you are very welcome here." Inside, an old but strong voice called, "Are they here, Liv? Bring them in. Don't leave them on the steps." They stepped inside. The air smelled like lemon polish and something older, maybe leather, maybe memories. The walls were covered with black and white photos of soldiers, airplanes, and young faces that had seen too much too soon. In the living room, Ezra Coleman sat in a big chair. A tube helped him breathe, resting gently against his face. His white hair looked like silver smoke, and his hands rested on a cane. But his eyes were sharp and bright. "There's my girls," he said, smiling wide. Lena stepped forward, suddenly shy. "Hi, great-grandpa." He smiled even more. "That's quite the yellow dress, young lady." Naomi added softly, "She says it's because she's like sunshine." Ezra chuckled. "She's not wrong." Then his eyes moved past Naomi and landed on Keanu. "Keanu Reeves." Keanu froze. Ezra's eyes twinkled. "I don't forget the faces I pulled from the fire." They laughed, a soft, almost secret laugh. "You saved me," Keanu said. "I never got to thank you." "You just did," Ezra replied. "By showing up." The afternoon sun streamed through the curtains. The air was quiet except for the soft hiss of Ezra's oxygen tank. Keanu sat across from Ezra in a wooden chair. The rest of the house buzzed with life. Lena's laughter, Naomi and Camille chatting in the kitchen. But here time felt slower. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Ezra broke the silence. "You've got the same look you had in Chad," he said. He wasn't tired from the trip. He was tired from carrying memories. Keanu gave a small smile. "You always saw too much." Ezra shrugged. "Comes with age. And sand. A lot of sand." They chuckled, but the laughter faded fast. "I was stuck in that village for 3 days, Keanu said. "No radio. No way out. I didn't think anyone was coming." "You didn't ask for help," Ezra said. "You just waited. Endured. Not everyone would have." Keanu looked down. "When I got out, I didn't forget. I tried to help quietly. No headlines." "You did," Ezra said. "I heard." Keanu's voice got softer. "I thought kindness was enough." Ezra's gaze sharpened. "It's not." Keanu looked up. "You stood up today," Ezra continued. "But let me ask you something." He tapped his cane on the floor. "Why did it take a little girl in a yellow dress for you to stand up?" The words hit like truth, heavy, clear, real. Keanu swallowed. "Because I got used to watching. To think being silent was neutral. That if I stayed calm and kind, that was enough." "But it's not," Ezra said. "Silence gets read as agreement. Especially by people doing wrong." Keanu nodded. "I know that now." Ezra held out his hand. Keanu reached out and took it. Strong. Steady. "You stood up," Ezra said. "Late or not, it matters. Now you have to decide what you'll do next." Keanu met his eyes. "Lena, she's something special. She has her mother's fire and her grandmother's strength." Ezra smiled. "Maybe she'll carry some of yours too." From the next room, Lena giggled. A crayon rolled across the floor. Ezra looked toward the hallway. "You want to repay a debt?" he said. "Look at that child. Don't let her grow up thinking kindness is enough. Teach her that courage is what's needed." Keanu nodded. He had no words. The next morning, Harlem woke as it always did, Kids laughing on their way to school, the smell of bagels in the air. But inside Ezra's brownstone, the air felt different. Keanu sat alone on the front steps, elbows on his knees, a cup of coffee beside him. His hoodie sleeves were pushed up. The morning was chilly, but his mind was somewhere else. Silence gets read as agreement. He took out his phone. His fingers hovered, then he made the call. "Hey," he said. "It's me. We need a full meeting today. Doesn't matter if it's Saturday. I'll fly to LA if I have to." 6 hours later, Keanu walked into Nordstrom Airlines headquarters. No hoodie now. A black blazer, a gray shirt. But the fire inside him hadn't changed. He stood in the boardroom facing 12 executives. "We're changing things," he said. "Right now. No small talk. No warm-up." He opened a folder and placed it on the table. The title read, Wings of Dignity Initiative. A New Beginning. Keanu continued, "It will be called the Ezra Coleman Legacy Lounge." One of the airline bosses leaned forward and asked carefully, "Why now?" Keanu didn't blink. "Because a little girl almost got sent to the back of the plane, our plane, because of her name and her skin color. And because the man who once saved my life never got the thanks he deserved." He looked around the room, his eyes steady and strong. "This isn't just for good publicity," he said. "This is about fairness. It's about remembering. And I'll pay for the first 2 years myself." The room went silent. One of the airline bosses dropped his pen. Another whispered, "He's serious." "I am," Keanu said. "Either we make flying better for everyone, or we don't deserve to fly at all." That evening, back at her home, Naomi heard a knock on the door. When she opened it, Keanu was standing there, holding a folder in one hand and a small wooden box in the other. "What's this?" she asked. "A beginning," he said. Inside the folder was a plan called Wings of Dignity. Inside the box was a brass nameplate with beautiful writing. It said, Captain Ezra Coleman Legacy Lounge. Lena peeked out from behind her mom. "Is that for great-grandpa?" Keanu knelt down and smiled. "It's for him and for you." The black car stopped outside JFK Airport at Terminal 4. But this time, Naomi's hands weren't shaking from stress. This time she was holding her grandfather's arm. Ezra stood tall in his dark blue suit. His medal shone on his chest. His matching cap sat snugly over his white hair. His cane tapped steadily on the ground as he walked, his oxygen tank rolling behind him. His posture was straight and proud. On his left, Lena held his hand. She looked beautiful in her yellow dress, now specially made to fit her. Tiny gold wings were stitched along the bottom of the dress. Her stuffed elephant, Mocha, peeked out from her backpack, ready for anything. Inside the airport, the air felt different. Flight attendants in full uniform stood in 2 straight lines. They weren't just standing there, they were waiting. Passengers nearby stopped walking. Phones slowly lifted as people realized something special was happening. Whispers spread like little sparks of light. "That's him, Ezra Coleman. A Tuskegee airman. My grandpa told me about him." At the end of the walkway, Keanu was waiting. No cameras. No reporters. Just him, standing with his arms crossed, wearing a simple gray jacket. When they reached him, Ezra didn't hesitate. He ignored the handshake Keanu offered and instead pulled him into a hug. "You move fast, son," Ezra said quietly. Keanu chuckled, his voice thick with emotion. Wasn't planning to waste time. Above them, a large velvet banner covered a doorway. Then it dropped. Gasps spread through the crowd. Behind it, large golden letters shone in the sunlight. They read, "The Ezra Coleman Legacy Lounge, honoring courage above the clouds and dignity below them." Lena's eyes widened. "It's real." Naomi swallowed hard, trying not to cry. "You deserve this, Grandpa. You always did." Ezra was silent for a long time. Then he spoke. "I never flew for awards. I flew to bring soldiers home. Some made it, some didn't." Keanu stepped beside him. "This isn't just for you. It's for every hero who never got thanked. You carry their names too." At the entrance, a red ribbon waited to be cut. Someone handed Lena a pair of golden scissors. She blinked in surprise. "Can I say something?" she asked. The room went quiet. The little girl in the yellow dress stepped forward, looking at the crowd. Pilots, passengers, and history itself waited for her words. "My great-grandpa didn't fly to be famous," she said. "He flew because people needed help." She paused and looked up at the shining letters above the lounge. "Helping people isn't something you do when it's easy. It's something you do when it's hard." She took a deep breath. "And I hope that when people walk through that door, they feel brave too." Her hands shook slightly as she cut the ribbon. A wave of applause filled the air, not loud and wild but deep and full of respect. A journalist near the back wiped her eyes. "This isn't just a lounge," she whispered to her cameraman. "It's a legacy." That afternoon, the sun shone warmly through the windows of Naomi's brownstone home. It felt like the sunlight was trying to stay a little longer. Inside, the house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full of memories. Ezra Coleman sat in his leather chair, eyes closed, breathing slowly. His blanket was tucked neatly around him. The soft hum of his oxygen tank filled the room. Nearby, Lena sat cross-legged on the floor in her yellow dress. A box of crayons was spilled around her as she drew a picture of a red-tailed plane with gold wings. The pilot inside wore glasses and had a smile just like hers. Naomi sat on the couch, surrounded by old letters. Thank you notes from soldiers. Letters from the war. Photos of men who had made it home, and some who hadn't. She wasn't just looking at them. She was remembering them. Great-grandpa? Lena asked suddenly without looking up. Were you ever faster than lightning? Ezra's eyes fluttered open. A tired smile spread across his face. Faster than fear, sunshine. That's what mattered. He reached to the side table and picked up a small velvet-wrapped bundle. His hands shook slightly as he held it out to her. This, he said, I wore on every mission. My first pilot's pin. Not because I fought hard, but because I never gave up. Lena took it with both hands, quiet and still. It's yours now, Ezra told her. Not to hide in a box. To remind you, sometimes flying doesn't mean leaving the ground. It means rising when the world tries to keep you small. That night, as city lights flickered outside, Lena curled up next to him, reading a bedtime story. Ezra listened to her voice. He fell asleep to the sound of her words. He didn't wake up. 3 weeks later, the gymnasium at Lena's school was packed. Students, teachers, neighbors, artists, and veterans filled the room. A handmade banner stretched across the wall. Wings that never land. The story of Ezra Coleman and the Tuskegee Airmen. The walls were covered in black and white photos, medals, and notes from students. In the center was Lena's drawing, Ezra holding her hand, his pilot's pin shining on her dress. Keanu walked in, dressed simply in a dark gray jacket. No cameras. Just him. Naomi met him at the door, surprised. You came back. I said I would, Keanu replied. Some flights are worth it. He carried a framed plaque, Ezra Coleman Memorial Aviation Grant. For kids who want to fly but were never told they could, Keanu said. Fully funded. Every year. Lena stepped onto the stage. The sky doesn't care what color you are. But down here people still do. That's why we tell stories, so the sky gets bigger for everyone. And somewhere, the wind whispered through an old brownstone window, carrying a legacy that would never land. If you like this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling adventures, mysteries, and unforgettable moments. Your support keeps these stories alive and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching. I can't wait to see you in the next video.